found as a pianist, I started very late actually. I started when I was about, let me think, it would have been about 12 and a half, 13, somewhere around there. And it was all really based on a kind of desire to be called a pianist and to be identified as a pianist. But it was the way it started was by actually me telling a lie at my school. Because I'd always been interested, and not only interested, fascinated by the pianos that I came across well, my grandfather had one in his house, the neighbour had one in their house. We didn't have a piano. I would spend all my time up at these pianos, just, experimenting, just, I don't know what you'd call it even, noodling. And I knew at that point that all music was trapped inside these 88 notes, and my job was to get it out. And it was an incredibly frustrating feeling, like I knew it was there, but I just didn't know how to do it. So I would spend hours on these pianos, and at school, I was already in my second year at grammar school, and the director of music said, "Hands up those boys who play an instrument." Hand shot up, and he said, "What instrument do you play?" I said, "Piano," most proudly. And then he came and he gave me this sheet of music, and he said, "Well, we're going to have you play this at the end of term concert." And I looked at it and thought, yikes, I can still remember that feeling of wanting the floor to open up, and because I didn't read music, I didn't really play the piano, but I took the piece of paper down to, it was only a single sheet of manuscript paper, I took it down to the lady who lived down the road, who I saw had a piano and played, could see through the window. I took it down to her with the cassette recorder. In those days we just had cassette tape recorders, and I asked her if she would play it for me so that I could listen to it, and she said, "I will leave it with me overnight and come back tomorrow and I'll practice it for you." And she did, and then I went the next day, recorded it, listened to it over and over and over and over until I could really hear it backwards, sideways, inside out, and was able to play it by ear in the concert. I can remember walking out onto the stage, putting my sheet of music paper up there and pretending to read it, but was actually playing it by ear. And the next day the lady who'd got wind of this story came to the house and knocked on the table. She said, "This boy needs piano lessons." And it was actually she who took me on for a year. She wasn't a piano teacher, she was a retired RE, that's scripture teacher. So she'd got very good teaching method. In other words, she knew how to communicate knowledge. She didn't have very much knowledge to impart, but she got me through the first few grades. And she said, "I can't teach you anymore, now you've got to go to a proper piano teacher." So that was the first part of it. Then I went to a proper piano teacher, and at that point was sailing along very nicely, making very quick progress and winning all sorts of festival competitions and festivals, and had trophies all over the piano. And it was really at about that point that I knew that my passion was totally into the piano, and other sorts of schoolwork, well, I was good at my schoolwork to a point, my energy went completely into my practicing. So that was the first stage of my piano career. In terms of the teachers that I've had, I've been very lucky to have a real mixture of teachers, and some really, all of them fantastic actually, wonderful. So the very first teacher I had at the Royal College of Music, Stephen Savage, he's still teaching at the Royal Northern College now. A wonderful, wonderful musician, and an incredibly energetic teacher, and an incredibly energetic musician, pianist. Those lessons were really the highlight of my first few years at the Royal College of Music. Stephen had come from the Cyril Smith English school, Cyril Smith being a great Rachmaninoff aficionado. He knew Rachmaninoff personally and played all the concertos, and Stephen was one of his students. And then after my undergrad years at the Royal College, I went to Peter Wallfisch, who was from the German background, had a Germanic, even though he was from Palestine, had a kind of Germanic, and then French as well. So he'd studied with some of the great teachers in Paris. So he gave me fingerings that had come from Ravel and from the horse's mouth. Wasn't interested in teaching technique at all. In fact, he got quite angry when you went to him with a supposed technical problem. All his solutions to technical problems were from the music. It was from the imagination, from the what sound do you want, what are you feeling, what's the music saying, and it was an incredibly kind of powerful way to teach. I would probably, when I look back now, I probably think he could have told me a little bit more about how he did things, because I know that he worked quite hard at his technique. He had a lot of warm-up technical exercises that he did every day, but he didn't want to bother me with those, because he said it was like doing my dirty laundry. He said, you don't want to see me doing my dirty laundry. So he was apologetic for that, about that. But my playing blossomed under his instruction and his inspiration, and still now I often think, what would Peter have said? You know, he died too young. We all his students revered him at the time, still do, and still miss him. So then that was the end of my studies at the Royal College of Music. Then I was lucky enough to get a Fulbright scholarship to go to America, and I had 1 year at the Peabody Institute, which was a fantastic year for me, 1982, a wonderful year. I had lessons with Anne Shine, great American pianist who'd been a student of Arthur Rubinstein, one of his two only students, and so she would give me fingerings. She said, "Oh, well, Arthur used to do it this way." She would give me Arthur's fingerings, which I've still got, some fantastic fingerings. She said Anne was a great inspiration. You know, she'd sit at the second piano and play exactly how she wanted to hear it, whatever it was that you'd brought. It was in her memory. So that was 1 year, and then after that I spent a long time with my, I guess you'd call my final teacher. But before I get into that, I cannot leave my Peabody days without mentioning Leon Fleischer and the fantastic inspiration and influence he had on me during that time. I wasn't in his studio, but we had a weekly class for pianists, first study, or piano majors as they call them in America. Really one of the, again, highlights of not only of that year but of my musical education. We just got to hear the wisdom every week for 2 hours, I think it was, 2 hours that flashed by, and that's still with me now. I still draw on that now. So that was my Peabody year, and then I went up to New York to study with Nina Svetlanova, who is still very much teaching Manhattan School of Music. Now Nina has an incredible pedigree. She worked for, I think it was many years with Heinrich Neuhaus, the great Heinrich Neuhaus, but before that she'd been with an incredible pedagogue, Grigory Kogan, who we don't tend to know in the West, but a very famous piano guy in the Soviet days. And I learned so much from Nina of what you'd have to call the great Russian tradition, in other words, the creme de la creme of the Russian tradition. And again, still very much that's absolutely focal to my thinking about piano playing. And I would also add the inspiration of a very fine teacher, Julian Martin, who is now on the faculty of Juilliard, has been for many years, but at that point was still connected to Peabody, who showed me the Taubman method, really, as he was experiencing it directly from Dorothy Taubman. He was working with her at the time. I was studying with him. So I got the Taubman approach to rotation, and we get into this in the technique series, from him directly, and it was an incredible addition to everything that I've learned. So it's another kind of ingredient in my recipe book of piano playing. And then just one more person I'd like to mention, and that's Peter Feuchtwanger in London, who has, or had at that point, guru status in the piano world. He showed me his exercises. I worked with him on his piano exercises, which really quite fantastic. Peter's now passed away, but again, his legacy very much lives on. So as you'll see from all of that, there's quite a mixture of influences, national influences, and some of them quite opposing, which is all good. You know, there's no one right way to play the piano, and there's no one approach that fits everybody. It's a multifaceted approach I have to playing the piano and to teaching the piano and to helping people. How do I approach teaching? I think it's a really big question, because the older I get, the more I realize that we're all different. Everybody is different. Everybody's mind is different. Everybody's hands are different. The way people process information is different. So there cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution either to how to teach somebody or the information to give them. So I tend to come from a very broad, eclectic place where I don't do one-size-fits-all either from a mechanical point of view, a technical point of view, or an interpretive point of view. And that for me is seriously important, because you only have to listen to 10 elite recordings, or 10 recordings of elite pianists playing to hear 10 different speeds, 10 different ways of pedaling, 10 different ways of phrasing, which proves that there cannot be one and only one way of doing things. So I'm against that kind of fundamentalist, this is how we do this is how we play this phrase, or this is the movement we use. I mean, obviously there are certain movements that we use at the keyboard that are kind of universal to the body. So I'm working very much naturally with the body, what the body naturally wants to do. So a healthy technique, an efficient technique, and solving technical problems with people all the time through a multi kind of faceted way of approaching the keyboard, and treating everybody with respect. I think that it comes down to that, treating everybody with the utmost respect and dignity, and giving them, trying to draw out from them what it is they want to do with the music. And I'll often ask, so what do you want to do with this piece? What character do you see in this piece? Where do you feel like you're struggling? Any particular areas of the piece that you want help with? So it's that kind of approach. So I feel like I'm sitting next to them, my sleeves are rolled up, and I'm working with them. A lot of teachers seem to work against, you get a sense of great ego from the teacher, and the student is a little worm on the piano stool, and the teacher sort of grinds the worm down into dust and then builds them up in their own image, which is a very common, very ugly to me way of teaching. It's a bit abusive, so I don't have that, anything that smacks of that. And I think people will come to a lessons, they'll feel a little anxious when they come. As soon as they leave, they'll realise that I'm on their side from the very beginning to the end. So it's being on the student side and just looking at them as individuals and treating them as individuals. Why practicing? Well, I think the thing with practicing is that it's such a rich subject and so little taught, or so patchily taught. I can remember with my first teacher, when she was having her baby, I was sent to somebody else for a few lessons, an amazing pianist, Philip Folk, who got me through my grade 8. And I would go to lessons with him, and if I presented with a particular problem, I'd say, I'm struggling with this here, I'm struggling with that there. He would ask me always the same question, how are you practicing it? Which alerted my attention to the fact that it was a process. It wasn't just, couldn't necessarily wave a magic wand over me and the problem would be solved. It would be a process. And the same thing happened with Nina Svetlanova, my last teacher, who would always ask that question in relation to a problem. And there was one particular lesson I went in with struggling with something that I thought was a technical solution that she could give me right there and then. She asked me the same question, how are you practicing it? So I'd say, well, I'm doing this, and she said, yes, somewhat impatiently, meaning of course, and then what's the next thing? And I had to generate a list, and she kept saying, yes, and after. And then when I'd finished, I think I must have got 8 or 9 methods or procedures that I was applying to that particular passage. She would say, it's the 4th thing, don't do that 4th thing, that's getting in the way of the rest of it. Do all the others, but it's that 4th thing. I forget exactly what that was now, but that was again a very important lesson. Practice. Some people come to me for lessons, they say, oh, I've got a real technical problem with such and such. It may be a technical problem, it may be a procedural problem, in other words, how they're absorbing the information from the printed page, filtering it through their minds and their bodies. So it's the process of practicing, what we do when we practice. It's not the amount of time we spend practicing, it's how we practice that really matters. So I've got a great interest in the subject of practicing and imparting some of these ideas to students who will often come back in a week with their playing completely changed, not because of anything magic that I've done or that they've done, but just because of a process that they followed. Step 1 leads to step 2 to step 3 until they reach the final kind of awakening that that's no longer a problem. They can do that easily. Well, yeah, the online presence thing started off with my wanting to write a blog, and just I saw that there were a few music or piano related blogs, and I thought, well, there's a subject that nobody seems to be covering much, and that's practicing. So I thought, practicing the piano. The title of the blog came from a very interesting book by Frank Merrick by the same title, Practicing the Piano, which I think is now out of print, but it was very much the sort of material that I was presented with, in terms of my training. I got a very, very thorough approach to how to practice, and I noticed that a lot of students came to me, or in my role as examiner and adjudicator, that they clearly didn't really know how to practice. So I thought, well, let's just start writing a little bit. So I started writing at the kitchen table, and I can remember it felt very much like writing an email, except at the end of it, instead of press send, you press publish. And then that, 3 minutes later, somebody in Timbuktu could be reading it. and then it sort of went from there, and then that led to the eBook series, which the people have told me, and people keep telling me how much volume of information there is in there, and how incredibly rich the ebooks are from the point of view of information on practicing, on technique, on dealing with anxiety, all of the things that really relate to performance is what we're on about here. So the ebooks then have a good solid foundation for what we're really doing now with the online academy, which was just to bring the knowledge to people who might not be able to get to a weekly lesson, or actually as a supplement to what they're already doing. The idea isn't that you learn to play the piano just from a website. I don't think that's ever been my idea. You need a real live teacher to sit with you week on week. But the Online Academy does reach a substantial audience, and what's great about it is you can look at it in your own time. People have said, oh, I love it because I can, I'm a bit of an insomniac. I could get up at 3 in the morning and read your stuff, and I can sit on my digital piano with my headphones in and try some of these things out. And I've had a lot of praise. People say that it really works and they love it, and so that's how the blog led to the ebooks, to the Online Academy, which is very much growing, almost exponentially growing. So the evolution of the Online Academy, it started off with just me doing my stuff, and then it came a point when I realized there were certain areas, important areas such as improvisation, which needed to be covered, and I'm not particularly au fait with improvisation. Probably should be more than I am, but I happen not to be. So we have Lucinda Mackworth-Young, who's come on board, the author of Piano by Ear, has come on board with that and has some terrific presentations on the Online Academy. We've got Kenya Hansen, who's got his series From the Ground Up, which I think is excellent, very much my way of doing things, where he takes a piece and basically takes it down, strips it down to its bare essentials, builds it up again gradually, sort of a deconstruction, reconstruction approach to certain pieces. It's very popular. I think it's excellent. Penelope Roskell, who is probably one of the UK's leading rehabilitators of pianists' injuries, healthy piano playing, made a long study of this, and her contributions are also invaluable in that area. The Piano Teachers Course UK, on which I happen to be a principal tutor, have the privilege of being a principal tutor, we have quite a lot of material now for piano teachers, but not only for piano teachers, for people who are interested in certain areas of piano playing.